We're going to start by addressing a question that I'm sure many of you have been asking in recent weeks as we come to the end of the book of Acts here, and that is, why are these chapters at the end of Acts so stinking long? Maybe you noticed it. In the first 20 chapters or so of the book, Acts, the action moves fast. The storytelling is tight. Everything seems to happen quickly and fully. And now we're running on about chapter 7 of hurry up and wait in a lot of cases. All of it told with what at times might feel like an excruciating level of detail. So what's the deal? What's happening is Luke's there. Luke is physically present in what's going on at the story through these last chapters, and Luke is catching up to the present. We're only about a chapter away from him getting to the point where he can't tell any more story because it hasn't happened yet. So just like if you were giving a life update to a friend, you might talk a little bit about some background that they need, but then talk about what's happening today. Luke as well is talking more and more as he gets closer and closer to what's happening in the present. Before we kind of launch into the full picture today, I just want us to be reminded by that this chunk of Acts teaches us that these are real events happening to real people at specific times in specific locations. And that seems normal to us, but that's because we're Western Christians. We've been shaped by the way the Bible talks to us about what's going on inside of it. That's actually really unique when we look at most world religions, where God's revelation tends to happen in private, often with made-up characters, and with details that don't hold up to historic scrutiny. So it's just a great thing to remember, to keep in mind as we jump into our text today. This passage describes the first part of Paul's journey from captivity in Judea to Rome and getting a hearing before the emperor. Excuse me. But, spoiler alert, this half of the story isn't going to go so well. There are going to be a lot of difficulties, there's going to be a lot of struggle and a lot of trials, and we're going to see a lot of precise details about those trials. As we look at those details, I want us to be able to think about and look for clues of how we should face trials in our own lives. So let's start by getting the background. Let's read Acts 27, verses 1 through 12. And when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra of Lycia. There the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go farther, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Salmone. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, "Sirs, I perceive that the voyage will be with injury, and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there, on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So after that, verses 1 through 8 travel log, remember real places, real people, real events. In verse 9, we start getting to where decisions are happening. There's a disagreement between Paul's advice and that of the owner and pilot of the ship. And it seems like the centurion's making the final call, and he goes with the pilot and the owner to say, let's go see if we can find a better port before the full onslaught of winter comes upon us. I think this gives us a solid chance of looking into how we make decisions in general as human beings. The Roman centurion was faced with a decision where he had no innate superior knowledge of the way forward. He had to listen to the opinions and ideas of others. The centurion was faced with a situation that demanded something called discernment. My favorite definition of discernment comes from the British pastor Charles Spurgeon. Spurgeon said, "Discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It is knowing the difference between right and almost right." And that seems to be what's happening here. The Roman centurion makes what, again, spoiler alert, by the end of the story is going to seem like the wrong call. But he doesn't do it out of selfishness or malice or ignorance or envy. He just listens to the wrong voices. As I was thinking about that this week, I remembered the story in 1 Samuel 13 where we find how Saul lost his place as the king of Israel. Kind of the straw that broke the camel's back in his disastrous time as king. And in that story, as you might see in these verses from 1 Samuel 13, verse 6 at the top and 13 at the bottom, Saul falls because he doesn't listen to the voice of the Lord. He chooses other voices to listen to instead. If we're being appropriately humble in our lives, I think it's important for us to see that we are very limited as individual human beings. There are so few things that we do out of our own expertise or wisdom or experimentation or so on and so forth. Most of the things that we believe and think and know in life are believed and thought on the authority of someone else. They did the work. They made the thing they taught us how to do it, and so we go on that. We've trusted them to tell us what we're thinking. Whether that be a friend, a teacher, a family member, a media personality, a professor, a YouTube tutorial, etc., etc. Whether it's fixing a toilet or making up our mind about a philosophical discussion, we're trusting other people to have done a lot of the homework for us. So one of the most important decisions we make every day is what and who to listen to. It's a great moment to ask ourselves some probing questions. Like, are the people that I give authority to in my life by listening to them and believing them, are they trustworthy people? Have they proven their trustworthiness with integrity over a long span of time? Am I trusting people because they claim membership in a group that I value and trust without finding out if they individually are trustworthy? Am I giving more weight to the voices of talking heads on TV or in media or social media influencers who don't know me and who, if they were told that I had died tomorrow, wouldn't even blink? Am I giving them more authority in my life by trusting them more than I do my friends, my neighbors, my family, my brothers and sisters in Christ? Do I trust voices who don't even know God and walk in His ways? There are a lot of good questions that we can ask ourselves here about which voices we hear and trust. And it's important to ask that question because even small things in life where we trust a voice can end up having big consequences. When we lived in California, I trusted that no one had thrown anything in the laundry that didn't belong there one time. I've trusted that a lot of times and ended up being wrong. Any of you who have young children will at some point find out what a diaper looks like after it goes through a wash cycle. But one of the most annoying ones for me to clean up was when a wad of paper towels got put in and got turned into confetti that stuck to every single piece of clothing in the entire load. It's a little thing. It's a tiny thing. But even trusting somebody on that tiny thing, like, did you put anything in the laundry that didn't belong there, can end up having big consequences. Or maybe another seemingly small decision, like whether or not the weather is going to hold out long enough for us to make it to a better port. We have to be careful of the things and the people that we're listening to and make sure that they're trustworthy. Let's read on into verses 13 to 26 and find out more about the consequences of what's happening here. Now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. Pause here. the more we get these weird specific notes, I just think of Luke having to learn all these words to then give them back to us. Like I think of Luke holding onto the rail as the boat just jumps up and down, and he's saying, "What is happening right now?" And the sailor goes, "It's a nor'easter, sir! Hold on tight or you'll be tossed into the heaving waves." I don't know when they got on a pirate ship, but it happened at some point. It was in my head all this week. I was enjoying the voice. I had to share it with you. Okay, let's keep going at verse 15. "And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of a small island named Cauda. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat," life raft. "After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus we were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed and began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned." Those last few verses seem like they're pretty much a very wordy version of, oh God, we're all going to die. They're toast. They're done for. They've given up hope of things going well moving forward. All is lost for them. And this is, again, another moment where we get to check our cultural instincts, the instincts that have been given to us by the world that we live in. Because in our culture, anything hard is bad. Anything hard is bad, period. And so we look for ways to avoid hard things. We need easier ways to cook food, easier ways to get information, easier ways to stay in touch with friends, easier ways to work out. Easy. Yeah, the older generations thought, oh, this is just going to be about all this digital stuff and the kids. No, you caught a stray there as well. No, we've all been doing this. Our culture's been doing this for decades and decades, looking for the easiest way possible out of any particular situation. It's not a new thing. This has been happening forever. You get the picture. And the reality is, none of those easier ways are necessarily bad things. But they reveal a tendency in us that we need to be aware of. That in our thinking and in our behavior, we assume that if things are hard, it's bad and to be avoided at all costs. And the reason we need to check that is that in this passage and elsewhere throughout the Bible, it is actually often at this very moment where things are hardest, where there is a real sense of hopelessness and despair, that God chooses to reveal His might to us. In 1 Corinthians 1, 27-29, we read, "But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God." This is that moment often. God has a history of showing up in these hopeless moments because in that moment we have abandoned our boasting and our pride, our hope in ourselves. It says there at the end of verse 20, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. In those moments of truly realizing our weakness, as John read before we started today, God acts to show His strength. We didn't actually specifically plan for this when we were doing all the sermon planning 6 months ago for this series, but I think that the last 2 chapters of Acts are a beautiful launching point for Advent, for the season that we're coming up to. Because this is, after all, the season to remember the darkness out of which comes light and the hope of Jesus. One of my favorite novelists, Wendell Berry, wrote of Advent, it gets darker and darker and darker, and then Jesus. And that's exactly where we find ourselves here in this passage. It's darker and darker and darker, and they abandon all hope, and then Paul stands up to talk to the crew. So let's read again, starting in verse 21. "Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, 'Men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart. For there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island first. Paul, I think here is a paradigm of the realism of Christianity. Friends, we aren't part of a religion of despair, but neither are we part of a faith that has no understanding of the brokenness and hurt of our world. Paul gives the sailors hope. He says, take heart, God will protect us. But he also says the ship is going to get destroyed and we're going to get run aground and all have to wash onto shore before we're out on the other side of this one. This is a fundamental part of the Christian faith. God is with us in the darkness, but that doesn't mean the darkness is easy. Those two things have to be held in tension. In the 1960s, Christians of the Maasai tribe in Africa chose to write a creed for themselves, a declaration of belief in their own language to form a foundation for their tribal church in interpreting the Bible and seeing God moving forward. And in it, they wrote of the Lord, translated into English, we have known this high God in darkness, and now we know him in the light. This is the reality that anyone considering whether or not to be a Christian has to wrestle with. If you're here today and you don't consider yourself to be a Christian, or you don't really know, but the idea of a God, the God that we've been singing about and reading about this morning, who is all-powerful, who knows you completely, and yet even in your brokenness loves you completely, if that idea intrigues and excites you, good, great, excellent, be excited. Dig down more into it. Find out more. Study more. Talk to me. Talk to someone here in the church. We would love to talk to you more about it. But make sure you're pairing that idea with this one too. That in God's great love for us, God will not hold us back from the things that will make us more like Jesus. Even if those things include trial or turmoil or suffering or struggle. In the Fellowship of the Ring, the first book, and yes, I know I just got one on the youth bingo sheet that you're all passing around. Yeah, I know about that. It's an inside joke with youth. I actually strongly approve of it. Good job, everybody. In the Fellowship of the Ring, it's the first book in the Lord of the Rings, and the Fellowship is talking after Gandalf has been lost to them. Their leader has fallen into the chasm of Khazad-dûm, fighting with a terrible monster. And afterwards, they're talking about the results. And one of the companions, Gimli, laments the loss. And actually, he starts questioning all their decisions so far because of it. He says, Gandalf chose to come himself, and he was the first to be lost. His foresight failed him. In other words, he says, we trusted Gandalf that this was the right decision, but it's brought suffering to us. He's fallen. It's all... How do we know this is actually the right thing to do? He says, maybe this was the wrong thing from the start because something bad has happened out of it. But another of the companions, Aragorn, says, the counsel of Gandalf was not founded on foreknowledge of safety for himself or others. And this is the part that really connects to our passage. He says, there are some things that it is better to begin than to refuse, even though the end may be dark. It's this concept that God is with us, yes, but that sometimes he's going to be with us in the dark. If you're here or you're joining us by video today and you're starting to feel God pulling on your heart, leading you toward faith in him, please follow. Please go after him. And please don't do it with false expectations, because we want you to be able to hold on. We don't want you to be disappointed partway through. Life as a Christian is sometimes hard, and we aren't guaranteed safety or comfort any more than anybody else is. But we aren't alone in it. We can say that on a human level because God has given us a spiritual family, the church, our brothers and sisters in Christ, but we also mean it on a spiritual level because in coming to Jesus, we find a God who cares about us. We find a God who took on flesh and moved into our neighborhood, who chose to love us, knowing that the cost for that love would be his life, and undeterred by that reality. Because of Jesus, we have a guarantee that the darkness will pass and that morning's light is coming. But we aren't there yet. As Christians, we're living in the now and not yet, where we have the promise, but we don't see the full reality yet. So the rest of our passage has some advice about what to do in the meantime. What do we do during the waiting? The sailors had been given, and Paul and everyone else had been given the promise of deliverance from the storms. We've been given the promise of deliverance from sin and the brokenness of the world, but we're waiting on both. What do we do while we wait? Let's read starting at verse 27. When the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. So they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little farther on they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that we might run ashore on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the back, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. So in a ship's boat, that would have been, if you didn't have a big enough port to dock the entire ship in, you would send loads back and forth, kind of like somewhere between a lifeboat and a smaller version of the main boat. And the only point I want to make here is the same one that Jesus made in Matthew 6:24. Jesus said, "No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other." And the sailors here have a moment of trying to serve 2 masters. Paul has promised that God is going to keep them safe. The centurion is now listening to the right voice, the correct voice, and listening to Paul. But the sailors have a moment where they're struggling. And they say, maybe we need to get out of Dodge. Maybe we need to get out of here ourselves. And they know that what they're doing isn't right because they fake, "Oh yeah, we're putting anchors off over here. Everything's good. We're fine. You're fine. How are you doing?" They don't want anybody else to know what's going on here. They try to sneak into the lifeboat and float away on their own. But Paul prevents them from doing so, knowing that they won't survive. That God said, those who are on the ship with you will live, and he doesn't want them in danger. And so he encourages the Roman soldiers to cut the lifeboat loose to the sea and eliminate the temptation. When I was growing up, one of my earliest musical memories is a cassette tape of the album Heaven in the Real World by Stephen Curtis Chapman. We listened to that cassette tape about 10 times moving from Kansas to Ohio when I was a kid, and I remember it very strongly. And in one of the songs, he talks about a mission led by Hernan Cortez in the 1500s from Spain to Mexico. Chapman puts the historical incident poetically when he wrote, "In the spring of 1519, a Spanish fleet set sail, and Cortez told his sailors this mission must not fail. On the eastern shore of Mexico, they landed with great dreams, but the hardships of the new world made them restless and weak. So quietly they whispered, 'Let's sail back to the life we knew.' But the one who led them there was saying, 'Burn the ships. We're here to stay.'" It's a historical event. Cortez burned his own ships to prevent his men from mutinying and returning before they had accomplished their mission. Cortez knew that as long as the temptation of another life was being held on to, his crew couldn't fully commit to their mission. Chapman later in the song uses that as an analogy for the Christian life when he wrote, "In the spring of new beginnings, a searching heart sets sail, looking for a new life and a love that will not fail. On the shores of grace and mercy we landed with great joy, but an enemy was waiting to steal, kill, and destroy." And here's what music does, because I haven't heard this song in 20 years, but quietly he whispers, "Go back to the life you knew." But the one who led us here saying, "Burn ships, burn the ships. It's great. He says this is kind of like what it is for the Christian life too. If you're holding on to other things, it's going to distract you. It's going to keep you from holding on entirely to God. We aren't going to be able to turn our eyes upon Jesus when we're constantly getting distracted by other stuff. We cannot live a double life if we are trying to trust in God's promises. The sailors couldn't, and we can't either. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying this morning. You don't need to be a monk. You don't need to only listen to Christian music, even. You don't need to cut off all your relationships with people who aren't Christians. No, please don't do that. God connected you with the people you're connected to in life so that you can bring the good news back with you to anyone else who needs it. No. What this is a call to avoid hypocrisy. It's a call to avoid a double life where we're trying to hold on to Jesus and trying to hold on to things that pull us away from Him at the same time. It's urging you to turn your heart totally towards Jesus, to turn your eyes upon Him so that you can see how He makes it possible for you to love and value everything else in your life in the right way when it's God who's on the throne. So let's keep reading, picking back up at verse 33. We got one more piece of advice for what to do while we're waiting. Advice number 1, burn the ships. Pick a direction and go. Advice number 2, as the day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you, take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Okay. Our last note today before we kind of roll into the end is do what you need to do to stay solidly on the journey, to keep your feet strong on the path of trusting in God's promises through the tempests of life. I love Paul's simple focus here. Hey, guys, you've been so scared that you haven't been eating anything for days. You're weak, you're hungry, you're getting mentally fuzzy. Get what your body needs to keep going, to be ready for what's coming ahead. As a parent, I think we all learn at some point that when our kids act out or misbehave, sometimes they need a deep conversation, some creative discipline, a heart-to-heart about valuing other people, and sometimes they need a snack and a nap. That's just the reality. Friends, we are all, to one degree or another, spiritual children, and there are going to be some times in your walk where you need the equivalent of a snack and a nap. For goodness sake, sometimes you're going to need it literally. You're going to need literally that. Sometimes you need more sleep and to eat better. Our bodies, our brains, our hearts, they're all tied together. What affects one of them affects the others too. So make sure you're keeping yourself up to date on the practical needs of your walk with God, whether that's physical or something else too. So maybe it's exercise and diet and sleep, but maybe it's doing some counseling to work on an issue left over from something hard you've gone through in life. Maybe it's stepping back from the busyness of the world around us and getting some real rest. I think in our modern society, our hustle and bustle, we gotta know that sometimes I'm the kind of tired that needs to sleep for 10 hours, and sometimes I'm the kind of tired that needs to stop saying yes to everything that everyone in the world ever asks me to do. 2 different kinds of tired. Friends, learn about yourself. Figure out what you need to know in order to stay solid on this journey. John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion starts with the sentence, "Nearly all the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of 2 parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves." So take the time during your walk to keep your eyes on Jesus, focus on Him, learn more of God, but also to figure out what you need to be doing to be solid on that journey, to be able to keep following God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Our passage ends in verses 39 to 44, and we're going to end there as well as we look at how God's promises are fulfilled. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable. The stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So we saw at the beginning of our passage about how God doesn't promise us that life will be easy. We looked a little bit about how we can keep our eyes focused on Him and on His promises amidst the storms of life. And as we close here, we get a reminder that God keeps His promises, and He cares about us even through the brokenness of our lives. In a couple minutes, we're going to close by singing "It Is Well With My Soul," a cherished hymn of the Christian faith. But it's really important this morning that we remember the background of where that hymn came from. Horatio Spafford was a businessman living in Chicago around the time of the Great Chicago Fire. And he and his wife and 4 daughters had planned on a trip to go and visit England when, again, the Great Chicago Fire happened. And in all the various things that Horatio owned, he found out that he would have to stay in Chicago to take care of business that was going on, or else risk losing much of what he had. And so Horatio's wife and 4 daughters went ahead of him. But as they crossed the North Atlantic, they were struck by another ship in one of the shipping lanes going across. Their ship sank to the ocean's floor very quickly and took with it Horatio's 4 daughters. His wife sent him a telegram from England that started out with the 2 words, "saved alone." Spafford got on a boat to sail across to join his wife and help her get home. And as he crossed the ocean, the captain was aware of what had happened and notified Horatio when they passed the place where his family's ship had sunk weeks before. And as they sailed across, Spafford wrote the poem that would later become "It Is Well With My Soul." When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, God has taught me to say, it is well with my soul. Friends, this song is just like the gospel. It's not a declaration that life will be without harms or trials, that it will all feel like nothing to us because we're just floating along happily the whole way. It's not a promise of ease and comfort. Rather, it is a defiant cry of hope amidst pain. It is a declaration that in the darkness of our existence, we still see the power of light. "It Is Well With My Soul" is Advent in a song. Darker and darker and darker, and then comes Jesus.